Objects in mirror are closer than they appear. And I'm sure that's true, but if you've ever looked in your rearview mirror and seen a dinosaur, and I'm not talking about Jurassic Park, I'm talking about driving over the bridge in Decatur and glancing in my rearview mirror and seeing the large extended head of a common snapping turtle staring at me in my rearview mirror. We had been fishing in the river, and I was trying to replace a trophy that I had. Years ago, I caught a snapping turtle fishing, and we ate it, which is very, very good, by the way. And I kept the skull, and I put the head of the turtle in an ant bed, and the ants picked it clean. And I had this really neat turtle skull that I used to sit on my desk and put a letter opener in it. Well, one of the students at Memorial Parkway borrowed it for a science project, and I never got my turtle skull back. And I've always wanted another turtle, and we caught one in the river one night while we were bow fishing. Caught it on the hook and line, and so I was going to take it home, have a little fried turtle, and then go and replace my skull. When we got out of the river that night, I just transferred the turtle from the bucket it was in into the bed of my pickup truck, and so I'm driving home. The sun's just coming up, and I'm driving. I've been up all night, and I'm kind of bleary eyed and kind of foggy headed because when you bow fish from dark till daylight. And I'm driving home, and I look up in the mirror, and then here's this large turtle staring at me. Yes, this turtle was large enough that he could crawl out of the back of a small Toyota pickup truck. Uh, I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if he was going to come in the cab and attack me. So I began to slow down. And when I got down to about 35 miles an hour, the turtle decided this is my chance, and he leapt to freedom. I could have stopped my truck at that early morning hour and gone back and gotten him. But, I felt like he'd earned his freedom. And I'm not sure whether I should name him Donatello or Chuck Norris because of this great move he made to gain his freedom. One of the more shocking things I've ever seen in my rearview mirror. Our house, the house we moved to in Gurley, Gurley, it is in the middle of a pasture, and one side of the road is still pasture, and then our side is developed. There's houses that people have bought land from Miss Luna, and beside our house is this flower garden. Well, it's not really a flower garden. Jackie had replaced all the flowers with blueberry bushes, and then she's planted some hosta and some other things. And we even had a little pond when we first moved there. We built a little mini pond there for this mud turtle that Lonnie Beth had, a little yellow-eared slider that she had named Turtle Man. Now, when I first caught him, he was about the size of a nickel or a quarter. And as we began to feed this little guy protein, he began to ramp up in size. And so he got to be about the size of my hand. And so we moved him outside the house to this little pond area. Well, this little garden became kind of an oasis. And so we have woods around the house, and we have the flower garden there, and we have the hosta bushes. And so one morning I'm driving to work, and I look up in my rearview mirror, and sitting on the toolbox of the tactical Toyota is this little green camouflage tree frog. Now, I'm not sure where he came from. I don't know if he came from the flower garden, if he came from the neighbor's trees in the backyard there. I'm not sure where he was. I'm not sure where he slept. But I know where he was when he woke up. He woke up on the toolbox of a black pickup truck going 60 miles an hour over Chapman Mountain. I looked up to change lanes, and there he was in all his glory surfing on the toolbox. Tree frogs typically have these large bulbous eyes. This guy's eyes were really, really large. As I got up to speed on Chapman Mountain, he turned from facing into the wind to looking back out the rear of the truck, and basically made himself aerodynamic and let the breeze blow over his little camouflage back. And he rode with me all the way to the office. Well, when I pulled into the old office at Century Office Center, that building no longer exists. But when I pulled in to the office there, he jumped from the toolbox and went under the wheel well. Now, I don't know what attracted him to my truck. I don't know if it was the gentle summer rain that year and he had left the flower garden to sit in a pool of water. I don't know if it was the fact that my truck might have had some residual warmth and that he was trying to regulate his body temperature. But this little frog followed me or rode with me all the way to work, and then he jumped off my toolbox and went under the toolbox into the wheel well of the truck. And on that particular day, I remember thinking, man, I hope it stays cloudy. Normally, he is surrounded by flowers and bushes and shrubs and even a little pond. But if he leaves my truck, he's not going to be surrounded by anything but black pavement. No blueberry bushes, no blackberry bushes, no hosta plants. If he gets out of my truck, he's going to be in the middle of a very black, very desolate, very hot parking lot. Now, for whatever reason, on that particular night, this little frog made his choice. And I don't know what lured him into the bed of my truck. It might have been bugs. It might have been the water that pooled in my truck because of the rain. Either way, this one little choice this little frog made carried him far, far from home. Now, if he stays in my truck, he'll end up going with me to SWAT training on that particular night. If he gets out and explores the parking lot at Century Office Center, there's no telling what fate awaits him. We often make little choices. The simple decision to go here, stay there. The simple decision to stay here, go there. Most of the choices that we make on a day-to-day basis are pretty inconsequential and they're benign. A lot of our choices don't have really long-term effects, but some of our choices do. Some of the choices we make without really thinking about the bigger picture will change our lives forever. The little tree frog that surfed on the tactical Toyota into Huntsville, it may change his life. He may not live past today. He was in some danger being in the parking lot. There may be birds of prey. There may be stray cats. He may make a decision to stay in my truck and ride with my truck to where I'm training with SWAT, and then he may make that his home, and he may become the SWAT frog. How cool would that be? In any case, he's just a frog. And for whatever reason, and he doesn't have the ability to reason, but for whatever reason, he ended up in my truck and didn't realize he ended up 20 miles away from home. And 20 miles is quite a distance for a tiny little tree frog. My father-in-law used to say, if a frog had pockets, he'd carry a pistol and shoot snakes. Well, if a frog could reason, if a frog could think, if a frog could see the bigger picture, I think he would have made different choices. See, you and I, we have the ability to plan, we have the ability to forecast outcomes, and we have the ability to make decisions. Well, at least we're expected to. You see, our choices affect our futures, and we alone are responsible to a great degree for how our lives turn out. If you read Stephen Glenn's book, Raising Self-Reliant Children in a Self-Indulgent World, he talks about 3 perceptions that we need. Everybody needs the perception of I'm capable, I am significant, and my choices affect my outcomes. I like to modify that to I'm capable, I'm significant, and my responses to the events in life determines my outcomes, not the events in and of themselves. If A is my life, if A is what happens to me, and C is my life, A does not equal C. It's A is what happens to me, B is how I respond to it, my choices, and C is my life, so A plus B equals C. Events plus my response to those events equal my outcomes. We have a generation of victims. We have a generation of learned helplessness. And people like to blame others. They like to blame society. They like to blame the system. They like to blame race. They like to blame privilege. They like to blame God for their lives. And it's just not that simple to abdicate personal responsibility and say, hey, I ended up where I ended up because of some other factor. No, you ended up where you ended up because of some choices that you made. Now, there may be some bad, terrible, unfair things that happen, but you still had to choose how you respond to them. We have opportunities, and every opportunity is a choice. And every choice is an opportunity, and every choice has a consequence. We are stewards. We bear responsibility for our opportunities and our choices. And you got to ask in the short term, where will my choices take me today? And you got to ask in the long term, where will my choices take me today? Are there long-reaching effects of our choices that we're not even aware of? Now, I wish the story about the frog ended here. I wish we could just talk in theory about the choices that a tree frog made. But After having this experience with the tree frog, several days later, I left my office, and to my dismay, I found the flat, paper-thin body of a little camouflage green tree frog in the parking lot. Yeah, I don't know for sure if this is the frog that I originally encountered. I don't know if it's the frog that I originally had hitchhike in to work with me, but I really think it is. There aren't really that many tree frogs at Century Office Center, and since I only know of one that had a career, albeit short career, as a hitchhiker, I, I've come to the sad conclusion that the choice to get into my truck was the first in a series of choices that cost the little tree frog his life. He first chose to get out of the flower bed and into the truck bed. And then he chose to get out of the truck bed and into the parking lot, and consequently got into a world that was way out of his depth. You see, those little choices can mean a lot. And it's not getting in the truck bed that killed him. It's not getting out of the flower bed that killed him. It's not getting out of the truck bed that killed him. He could have gotten in or out at any certain other time and lived to be a ripe old age. Frogs get when they're considered to be ripe old frogs. The problem is that this little tree frog, and he lacks the ability to do it, but he lacked a greater worldview. He lacked the ability to comprehend an expanding world that was beyond his ability to comprehend or reason or react to. He didn't know anything about automobiles. He didn't know anything about pavement. He didn't know anything about tall buildings. He just simply made a choice, and probably the choice he made was based on something super simple. No doubt as it got hot in the bed of the truck, he simply did what frogs do. He went for a place that wasn't as hot. Frogs are amphibians. They can't self-regulate their temperature. He got out of the flower bed into the truck bed, and as the day began to warm up, he got out of the truck bed and looked for a cooler, nicer place. But he didn't realize that when he jumped out of the bed of my truck, there was nothing but pavement waiting on him. And pavement's hot in the summertime. You know, he basically made the same decision he made at my house. He decided to hop around and look for something cooler. Now, if he'd stayed in my truck, he might have had a similar fate. He might have had a heat stroke in my truck. But he got out of my truck and got crushed by possibly another truck. I know it was an automobile. I don't know it was a truck. I don't want to place the kind of consciousness on a frog that Walt Disney would have us think they have, but they just aren't that sophisticated. They aren't that complicated. But he didn't comprehend the vastness of the world that he lived in. His worldview didn't go very far beyond blueberry bushes, hosta plants, and a little pond. And then all of a sudden his worldview became the bed of a pickup truck, and when the pickup truck got uncomfortable, he left it. And again, you know, frogs don't have expectations, but he left that instinctually thinking, I'll find something cool, moist, shady. But he had to go a long way from Century Office Center to find any shade. He'd had to go a long way from Century Office Center to find any plants. And so he ends up outside of the truck on this black pavement. And probably what he did was just simply got under the tire of a car in the shade and waited. And he didn't realize he was waiting on his death. He was involved in a world that his little frog eyes couldn't see and his little frog brain couldn't grasp. And without being just too cruel, he probably didn't even realize he was being crushed. He's in this parking lot and he's sitting under a tire. He's hopping across the parking lot and an automobile comes by, and the mass of a little tree frog is inconsequential to an automobile. The person driving the car never realized there was a frog in the way. He never knew what happened to him. He never knew what hit him. Even if he'd had the ability to have cognition about those events, he wouldn't have recognized it happening to him. It would have just been over so fast. If you're a person who does not acknowledge the spiritual world, if you blissfully only look at the material world and you only have a physical worldview, and you live only in response to stimulus. Seek comfort, avoid discomfort. If you live that way, being driven by your needs and your passions and your desires, and you live unaware of a larger, expansive spiritual world, then often that perspective will cause us to be crushed by forces and factors that are beyond our comprehension or beyond our acceptance, because accepting them is really not a matter of intellect. It's a matter of you see these evidences and you just deny them. A world as complicated and well-ordered as ours did not occur by accident. So there's something beyond the material world. There's forces and things driving it. And you just have to basically decide to ignore it, If we live merely as quote unquote evolved animals, then we're not allowed to talk about right and good and fair and true, because evolved animals don't have those kind of thoughts. They just live on survival. They just respond to instinct. They're pleasure seeking and pain avoidance and survival driven. You live that way, you ignore the spiritual realm, you ignore the kingdom of God. And then just like that little tree frog, you go through life like a little dumb animal. Paul uses the phrase as brute beast. If you only follow the natural thing to do, then you'll end up being moved, transported, carried away, and even crushed by forces that either you never knew existed, or at least you failed to accept or failed to admit existed. See, from a little frog brain and little frog eyes, the point of view is water, heat, shade, comfort, survival. It was instinctual, not intellectual. The choices he made were just natural for a frog. They felt natural, and it was the right thing to do if you live from a frog viewpoint. The problem was that when he got out of the flower bed and into the truck bed, it wasn't the natural world of a frog. And when he got out of the truck bed expecting to find the flower bed, he'd been transported to an entirely different environment that had nothing that he was expecting or needed. See, once he left the truck, it was hot pavement, towering buildings, and massive cars. And as I said, the car that ran over him never knew he existed. If he'd been able to comprehend automobiles, if he'd been able to comprehend mass and physics and being crushed, if he'd had that world view, he'd have never gotten in my truck. He'd have never gotten off my truck. And he would not have been crushed by another truck. From a purely physical point of view, we could live, and it may look like food, shelter, clothing, pleasure, survival. But there really needs to be a more expanded worldview that includes other greater forces. Because there are forces of right and wrong and good and evil. And they give us not only the power of choice, but the responsibility of choice. And oftentimes it's the choice between the spiritual versus the physical, the eternal versus the temporary, the things that are seen versus the unseen. If you make choices oblivious to the existence of those forces, you make choices oblivious to the expanded worldview, then the choices you're making are from a very, very limited information, and they make for a very poor choice making. A lot of the choices that we're faced with go way beyond what we view as just the physical world, and they often deal with the spiritual world. And you can deny the spiritual world, or you can ignore the spiritual world, but you don't have to believe in something for it to be real. If a frog had pockets, he'd carry a pistol and shoot snakes. If a frog had cognition, he'd make different choices. If a person realized you don't have a soul, you are a soul. If we made that realization as people, then we'd make choices not based on the physical, temporary, mortal worldview, but rather from a perspective of a spiritual, eternal, and an immortal worldview. If this little frog had simply had the ability to look at the vast world he was jumping into, if he'd looked before he leapt, if he just simply asked, what am I getting out of and what am I getting into? What will this choice get me and what will this choice cost me? See, if we could just look further out and change our little frog mind and a little frog viewpoint and realize that there is a spiritual beyond the physical. There is life after death. There is eternal after the mortal. And to quote General Maximus Decimus Meridius in the movie Gladiator, what we do in life echoes in eternity. If we understood that, then unlike the little tree frog on my truck, we would look before we leapt.